Welcome back. I'm Rachel Blevins, and this is The Backstory. So as we continue this conversation about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's little Middle East tour, it was a very frantic one, if you could say that. He went to Jordan, he met with leaders there. He then also went over to the occupied West Bank, where he met with the head of the Palestinian Authority. And then he notably wrapped it up, which I guess taking it beyond the region, taking it over to Turkey. Now, the Associated Press is reporting that more than a week after starting to publicly push for humanitarian pauses in Gaza, the Biden administration had little to show for its efforts as Blinken ended a grueling Middle East tour on Monday, and President Biden made an apparently fruitless personal appeal to his Israeli counterpart. Interesting to see how very open the Biden administration is being here in calling for some sort of a pause, and how open at the same time Netanyahu is being in refusing that call altogether. Now, asked whether the toll gave the U.S. pause for staunch support for Israel, Kirby said, quote, "I think we all need to remember who they're fighting." And he referenced Hamas and their October 7th attack into Israel that killed 1,400 people, mostly civilians, and started the war. Again, this is an ongoing battle that has been happening for a while now. I wouldn't say it would necessarily started on October 7th, but rather that is kind of the next phase of it. The current phase that we're in began then. He insisted that no country would tolerate such an attack without a swift and aggressive response. But of course, that response has continued to target the civilians, as we have noted. So let's get into all of this now with our next guest. Joining me now to discuss is DeBar, a geopolitical analyst and the executive producer at CPR News Radio. Don, it's great to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here, Rachel. Thank you.
Now, when it comes to Antony Blinken, we've seen him go back and forth to Tel Aviv, but this weekend, he went on a little bit of a broader Middle East tour. It's being referred to as frantic. What do you think that his goal was with this tour?
I mean, it's an interesting mix of people. Go backwards. So I'm looking at his website, for example. Yesterday, Baghdad, Ramallah, Amman on Saturday. Also Tel Aviv on Friday. And he met with Herzog, who's the president, Gantz, who's the minister, and this guy, Lapid, who is the opposition leader, who's a real piece of work. He was the one that last week was lecturing the media. Let me get this right. I want to quote this exactly. If the international media is objective, it serves Hamas. If it shows both sides, it serves Hamas. My argument is that the media can't claim to bring both sides of the story. If you do that, you're only bringing one, Hamas's side. So this is somebody that Blinken needs to meet with, okay? And I guess he's going to get some pointers on propaganda. I don't know. He's also going to, let's see, the whole trip that's scheduled has Turkey he's going to, and then he's going off deeper into Asia, Tokyo, Seoul, New Delhi. He's going to try to get some more, demonstrate more support for Ukraine. And I don't understand the thinking here, because no matter what the governments want to do, and that's who he's meeting with, we're seeing laying out on the ground now in the area around Israel, from Turkey to Iraq, that in every which way, the Bahrain we saw today, the people in those countries, including Saudi Arabia, are watching with horror at the slaughter of the people in Gaza. And they, Saudi Arabia spends as much money as Russia on its military up until the special operation last year, somewhere in the vicinity of $65 billion a year. And they're sitting on their hands watching Israel slaughter Muslims. They're supposed to be the keepers of Mecca and all of that. The people in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, every country in that region are aghast, and the governments are going to have to act. And I don't know what Blinken thinks he's going to convince the governments to do, because the people are going to throw them over if they don't do something.
Yeah, absolutely. I still can't get over that quote, to say that if you're showing both sides, then that is essentially serving one side is just insane. But I mean, I guess maybe he's being honest in his mind of saying that people are not going to be in favor of what Israel is doing if they see all of the information and not just sort of this line of propaganda that is being shown to them. Now, one of the things that we saw from Blinken was he goes to Jordan, he meets with leaders from Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, and they're all talking about the need for a ceasefire. That is the buzzword right now. But yet that is the word that the West refuses to even say. I mean, we saw Justin Trudeau had to correct himself when he was doing this press conference. He started to say ceasefire, and then he tripped over it as he was quickly going to humanitarian pauses. Blinken is again using this language of humanitarian pause, that's what we need to focus on. Why do you think that the West is taking this approach, and what do you think they mean by a humanitarian pause in this case?
What I'm looking at, basically, the distinction between those two things, a humanitarian pause means you can evacuate some people, feed some other people, and then get back to the business of leveling the place and evicting everyone from it. To me, this looks like a more honest version of what happened to the cities in the United States starting in the 1950s with what they called urban renewal, where you moved, in essence, there's a Rand Company study that showed as black people were, essentially escaped the South because the agricultural industry no longer offered them any, and the factories in the North were offering jobs. As they were concentrated in different areas because of segregation, even in the North, the housing segregation, all of a sudden, the powers that be realized political power was being collected in each of these cities. You had got people like Adam Clayton Powell and others in Congress all of a sudden, and so they were panicked by this because black people were making demands on the government from a position of power. And so Rand came up with the idea, basically, to scatter the people to the four winds and dilute the power and scrape the buildings, the neighborhoods down, and that's what happened. That's what they called urban renewal. What we're seeing here is, in essence, a real estate deal. Israel is taking Gaza by condemnation, I guess, if you want to put it that way, and they are leveling it. And usually what they did in urban renewal, you evict the people, they go wherever they go, you build housing for them in some cases, in a lot of cases, so that they get out of the area and they're scattered. Then you scrape the area and you redevelop it, gentrify it is the term, the polite term that they use now. In essence, this is like a gentrification effort on steroids, and the people who live in Gaza now and who are being evicted now are going to be replaced by Israelis. The ones that survive will be replaced. The others will be buried under the rubble.
Yeah, it is just a very gruesome, outlook. And I think that it's interesting that Blinken on this trip, he wanted to talk about quote unquote post-war Gaza. Like he's wanting to talk to the head of the Palestinian Authority and saying, oh, well, you can play a role in this. And yeah, it's almost as if he's saying, hey, here's our building plans after we get rid of the, just 2.3 million people who live here. Then we're going to look about what we're going to do. Let's look towards post-war Gaza. And it's like completely ignoring the fact that in the meantime, what you were doing is effectively carrying out a genocide in order to then get to that point and to then get to those drawing plans of what I guess Israel is preparing for all of this. For someone like Blinken to go and meet with these leaders and to make these claims, I mean, do you think that any of them actually take him seriously at this point, or do you think that they're just tolerating these meetings because it's someone from the United States and they are looking at it as, okay, we need to at least keep this country on some decent terms, or else we could see yet another war, because that's what the U.S. loves at the end of the day?
Well, from watching what's happened so far, and as you pointed out, and as we all know, this does not begin October 7th of this year. And it doesn't even begin October 7th of 2001 when George Bush invaded Afghanistan, by the way. That's an anniversary day. This begins before 1948, before the Nakba, with the terrorists that had gathered there to begin evicting the Palestinians from what they called at the time as Israel Israel to be able to construct a Jewish state, as they put it. This is, Herzog, the whole group of Zionists that, came together in the late 19th century, late 1800s, and, made the deal with Balfour in 1917. This was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and then after World War I, Britain became the colonial power, and they started parceling it up the way they did Africa and everywhere else. Britain's mode of empire was to divide and conquer. And so the way they divided Palestine was to start basically inviting European Jews to come help settle it. And you had two groups that had an antagonism, and we're still seeing it today. The whole idea of, in essence, when you have Blinken there, Blinken is looking at the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, which is run by Saudi Arabia now, the pretender to the throne in Saudi Arabia's share of Yemen, across the region, with a couple of exceptions, they're basically compradors in the empire. These are people that have been installed to keep the oil flowing to Europe and the United States, to keep the people at each other's throats so that they don't turn around and do what Iran did in the 50s and what Iraq did to a degree and what Egypt did in the 50s with Nasser in the early 60s. They want to keep them in the condition of being colonies, to the empire. And Blinken is like he's like the viceroy going there. It's either peer to peer with those people, or he's sort of like the lieutenant and these are the captains under him or something. So, they listen to him, but they know he's not really the power. He's just some administrative bureaucrat that's bringing like the latest, packet to them to look at and see, maybe we could try this. I don't think anybody really takes him too seriously, but he represents somebody that they all take seriously, whoever it is that writes their paycheck.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know that he's coming in with his packet that just has humanitarian pause stamped on it, and they're having to at least deal with that conversation. Now, another stop that Blinken made on this tour was over in Iraq, and we've had a number of reported attacks against U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria over the last few weeks. And it's been interesting to kind of watch the response from the Biden administration, acting shocked as if they just built these miniature cities that were, in these other countries that aren't actual military bases, and they're surprised that they would be targeted whatsoever, especially in Syria, where they're illegally occupying the country. What did you make of what we saw from Blinken there, and the fact that he notably did stop in Iraq at all, even to just have a few words and to kind of shoot off a warning towards Iran? It seemed that he was targeting in that direction during this tour.
Well, he had to meet with the Prime Minister, al-Sudani. Again, the people of Iraq, they know exactly what America is. Okay, they've had a very thorough education in that. The people that were supposed to be welcoming American troops in 2003 with flowers and the guns and all of that stuff, shot and killed and blew up and strangled and whatever else they could to as many of them as they could reach in response to what was being done to them. Not even beginning with shock and awe, which is disgusting and horrible enough, and which also, by the way, it pales compared to what's being done right now to Gaza. Okay, if that was shock and awe, because shock and awe killed 6,500 people in Iraq between March 20th and I think April 18th. Okay, so you're talking 11 and 18, like 29 days. There are 10,000 over the last 29 days that have been killed in Gaza. So, just on scale, I don't know what name you would put on this as opposed to shock and awe. But, in terms of scale, it's more shock and much more awe. But before shock and awe, you had the 1990/91 war on Iraq that blew up a whole bunch of stuff. And then, aside from various sorties over the course of the 90s, like every time Bill Clinton got in trouble for, dating Monica or whatever nonsense happened with him, he blew something up in Iraq. They starved it. You remember Madeleine Albright, 400 or 500,000 dead children starved, and it was worth it. So the people of Iraq aren't having an American excuse for why Israel is being allowed to blow up people in Gaza. And al-Sudani has to answer to them in a very volatile environment. And so, I don't know what it is that Blinken could say that would satisfy, other than I'm going to go hang myself, that would satisfy the people of Iraq. But, he has to try to do diplomacy to help manage that. To me, it seems like the diplomacy he should have done for the government in Baghdad would be to stay the hell away from there. But I don't think that, I think there's such a heavy streak of arrogance and impunity among these people that they really don't pay close attention to exactly how other people see them.
Yeah, I would say that that's a fair point. And yeah, anything short of him showing up and saying, all right, we're leaving is probably not a very welcome message in their eyes, and rightfully so, for everything that they have been through. Now, another country where Blinken went, although he didn't exactly get the warmest reception, was, of course, Turkey. Now, Turkey has been an interesting element in all of this because, of course, they're a NATO ally, but there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of frustration over the sanctions campaign against Russia, and really just frustration from the entire NATO alliance with Turkey, and with them feeling like Turkey is not complying in the way that they want them to. Now Turkey is incredibly frustrated with Israel and with this ongoing bombardment, and you've seen protests on the ground there. So what do you make of the fact that Blinken specifically decided to go to Turkey instead of just wrapping up this tour and saying, okay, I'm going to keep it here, to these countries and then go home? He notably made one more stop.
Well, first of all, Erdogan wouldn't meet with him. He sent the foreign minister for a 2.5-hour meeting today in Ankara. And Erdogan has been speaking, rather tough. And Erdogan is in an interesting position, and he's an interesting character, too. You're right, pointing out the role he's been playing. Turkey's had an interesting role in relations between the U.S. and Russia, prior to that Soviet Union, for quite a while. But, one minor part is the part that Turkey played by hosting Jupiter missiles in the early 1960s that ended up being the inducement for Russia or the Soviet Union to place missiles in Cuba that almost ended the entire human race. Turkey has always been sort of the, frontier state of NATO, and they play an interesting role with NATO because Turkey is, like other parts of Western Asia and some parts of Eastern Europe, like Ukraine. For some reason, there's an attraction to Western European culture where they think this is the center of the universe, and we want to participate fully with you guys as one of you. And Turkey gets treated sort of like the redheaded stepchild by they've been trying to get into the EU since the EU was founded, and they've been sort of having that dangled in front of them, and yet. Not only do they host a big chunk of NATO, which is in essence the same members as the EU in terms of Europe, a big chunk of their military hardware and personnel on their territory. They've also acted as proxies, sponsoring, various jihadi groups, taking out Syria, doing other things, basically as agents of the United States and of NATO, and they really get nothing for it. They almost got dragged into a war with Russia with a shoot down of a Russian pilot over Syria about 10, 12 years ago, and a number of other incidents. Meanwhile, while he's being a faithful agent of the West, the West got caught plotting against him. The phone call from, I think it was a phone call, from President Putin saying, watch out, a coup attempt this weekend. And he was ready for it, or else, he would have been either at the end of Saddam Hussein's rope or cellmate with Noriega or whatever plan they had for him. So he has been, and his objective position, Turkey, situate where it is, if you're really looking out for Turkey's interest, you're in an ideal position while you have two blocks, one on either side of you, to play honest broker, to work one side against the other for your own advantage, to have access to all of those markets and to trade with everybody. And unfortunately, the government in general in Turkey, and I think the military in particular, they're kind of captured, to use that term. Erdogan, however, is like a puppet that's ripped off his strings, and he's like trying to dance on his own right now. And I see that he cannot go back to the people in his country and say, I stood by with all of the military wherewithal that we have and the economic power that we have, and watched Israel slaughter the Palestinians, because he'll also get tipped over. And he has the military on the other side saying, you can't go too crazy here or we're going to take you out, and the United States saying, yeah, and they will. But he's trying to play honest broker, and he is positioned to do it, with the exception of the problems he's got that I just listed.
Yeah, it's fascinating. A lot of moving parts there, obviously, when it comes to all of this. Now, moving on from Blinken's little tour, you've got so many different countries in the world now calling for a ceasefire, and you have the U.S. refusing to do so. You have Israel refusing to take any action. What are you keeping an eye on when it comes to the Biden administration and their role in all of this in the next week or so? And we've got about a minute left.
Yeah, we've got a very volatile world situation right now, and we've had the temperature taken of the world governments based on their read of their own people 3 times in the last week and a half. One was on a ceasefire resolution at the General Assembly, that not a humanitarian pause, but a ceasefire resolution that went 120 out of 193. But there were only 14 votes against the United States and Israel, okay? And then out of the remaining 12, 6 of them are little island nations with like 2 people and a goat living on them that the U.S. nuked from 1948 to 1963. So you really had 6 nations that voted against it. The EU and NATO people mostly voted, abstained. And so the world, 2/3 of the world's population was represented there, and they want a ceasefire now. So that's the first one. The same thing happened with Cuba. This year you only had 2 votes against the resolution condemning the United States over the blockade on Cuba, and 1 abstention. It was the U.S., Israel against, and Ukraine abstaining. And then you had 1 more vote. I forget what it was yesterday. That it was also lopsided like that. So the U.S. is isolated as we go into this dangerous period, and they've got Israel by their side, also isolated.
Certainly a lot at stake here. Don DeBar, geopolitical analyst, thank you so much for your time and insight. And thank you all for listening. That's all for today's show. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on The Backstory.